She thought love was something you organize for other people. There are certain things Melinda de la Vega believed with absolute certainty. Coffee should be taken black and burning hot. High-heeled sandals were a cruel invention society forced on women. And her best friend Lucia Torres had the worst taste in men in recorded human history. Melinda sat on the small gray couch of her Madrid apartment, watching Lucia cry for what felt like the 15th time that week, spooning chocolate ice cream straight from the container as if it were medicine. Her mascara ran freely down her cheeks, leaving dark trails that mirrored the emotional exhaustion in her eyes. That was the moment Melinda made a decision that would quietly, irrevocably change her life. "That's enough," Melinda said, taking the ice cream from Lucia's hands. "I'm done watching you let a man who doesn't respect you ruin your life." Lucia looked up at her, eyes swollen, voice trembling. "But I love him, Mel. I know he treated me badly. I know he's awful, but..." "But nothing," Melinda interrupted, already thinking several steps ahead. "What you need is distance. Sunday fresh air. And a man who reminds you what it feels like to be valued." And then, like a dangerous spark landing on dry grass, the idea formed. Carlos Gutierrez. Carlos had been Melinda's best friend since they were 15. He'd seen her embraces, bad hair dye, and emotional disasters. He had helped her move apartments 3 times, tolerated her love for terrible romantic movies, and made the best Spanish omelet she'd ever tasted. Carlos was kind, stable, successful. An architect with quiet confidence and a beach house he'd inherited from his grandmother. Carlos was perfect, just not for her. The math was simple in Melinda's mind. Carlos plus Lucia meant Lucia finally forgetting her toxic ex, problem solved. "What are you planning?" Lucia asked, narrowing her eyes. "I know that look." "I never plan," Melinda said sweetly. "I organize favorable coincidences." 3 hours later, Lucia had agreed to a week at the coast. And Melinda was dialing Carlos's number, unaware that she had just invited the universe to teach her a brutal lesson about self-deception. Carlos answered on the 3rd ring. "Tell me you haven't burned another kitchen." "That was one time," Melinda protested. "And it was the oven's fault." He laughed, warm and familiar. "So why are you calling?" "I need a favor," she said. "What kind of favor?" "The kind that involves your beach house, a free week, and emotional patience." There was silence on the line. "Melinda?" "Please," she said softly. "Lucia is falling apart. She needs to get away. And you're good with people. You helped me after Javier, remember?" Carlos exhaled. "1 week," he finally said. "No chaos. No disasters." "I promise," Melinda lied, crossing her fingers behind her back. When the call ended, she opened a note on her phone and typed. Operation, Lucia and Carlos. Day 1, romantic dinner under the stars. Day 2, sunset beach walk. Day 3, surf lesson at dawn. Day 4, boat ride. Day 5, movie night. Day 6, intimate barbecue. Day 7, emotional goodbye and confession. Perfect. Foolproof. She had no idea she had just scheduled her own emotional collapse. The Saturday they left, the sky was flawless. Melinda packed carefully, 3 bikinis, summer dresses, sunscreen, candles, and a carefully curated playlist. Lucia packed everything she owned. When Carlos arrived, leaning casually against the doorframe, Melinda felt something unexpected twist in her stomach. He looked different, relaxed, strong, real. She ignored it. This was for Lucia. The drive to the coast was comfortable, familiar, full of shared laughter. When their hands brushed while changing the music, Melinda told herself the strange spark she felt was just static. The beach house was perfect. White walls, blue shutters, golden sand stretching into turquoise water. Lucia smiled for the first time in weeks. Melinda gave her the bedroom next to Carlos's and took the far room herself. Distance, she thought. Space. Control. The first evening didn't go as planned. Carlos got stuck working. Lucia fell asleep early. The candles remained unlit. It's fine, Melinda told herself. We have all week. The second morning she initiated the surf lesson. Romantic, symbolic, perfect. Except Lucia couldn't stop checking her phone. It's just a message, Lucia said. From Damian. The name alone tightened Carlos's jaw. Lucia left. And suddenly Melinda was alone with Carlos in the water. Looks like you're my student now, he said. And that was the moment everything began to go wrong. The surf lesson was chaos. Melinda fell repeatedly, swallowed seawater, tangled herself in the board. But Carlos was patient. Encouraging. Close. Too close. When she finally managed to stand on the board for 3 glorious seconds, she laughed harder than she had in months. Carlos caught her, steadying her, hands firm at her waist. Their eyes locked, and something unspoken shifted. Then a wave hit them both. Art. When Melinda surfaced, panic struck. Her bikini top was gone. Carlos reacted instantly, placing himself between her and the beach, shielding her without hesitation, without comment, without judgment. "I've got you," he said quietly. And for the first time, Melinda felt what it was like to be truly protected. Wrapped in a towel later, heart racing, she watched Carlos walk back into the ocean to give her privacy. And the truth hit her with terrifying clarity. She wasn't helping Lucia fall in love. She was falling herself. She kept building romance for him, hoping it would lead anywhere but her. Melinda told herself the feeling would pass. That whatever had sparked in the ocean that morning was nothing more than embarrassment mixed with adrenaline. A moment amplified by sun, salt, and the vulnerability of nearly being seen. That was the story she repeated to herself as she wrapped the towel tighter around her body and followed Carlos back to the house. Both of them strangely quiet, both pretending nothing had changed. Inside, Lucia barely noticed their return. She was sprawled on the couch, phone pressed to her ear, whispering urgently. Melinda caught only fragments. "I miss you, maybe you're right? I don't know," before Lucia disappeared into her room and shut the door. Carlos went to the kitchen without a word. Melinda stood alone in the hallway, heart pounding, suddenly aware that her carefully arranged week was already unraveling. Still, she refused to abandon the plan. If she stayed focused, if she remembered this was for Lucia, everything would fall back into place. Had to. That afternoon, Melinda forced herself into motion. She chopped vegetables, set the table, and talked far too much about unimportant things. Carlos listened politely, though his eyes drifted to her more often than before, lingering just a moment too long. Each glance felt dangerous. That evening was supposed to be simple. A relaxed dinner, casual conversation, gentle bonding. But Lucia arrived late, distracted, her smile fading every time her phone vibrated. "Could you not check that right now?" Melinda asked, sharper than she intended. Lucia looked up, surprised. "It's just Damian." Carlos's fork paused midair. "I thought the point of this week was to forget about him," he said calmly. Lucia bristled. "You don't get to tell me how to heal." The air thickened instantly. Melinda felt it slipping. Control, intention, clarity. She excused herself early, claiming a headache, retreating to her room where she sat on the bed and stared at the wall. Why did it hurt so much to hear Lucia defend him? Why did it hurt even more to see Carlos disappointed? The next morning, Melinda doubled down. She woke early and prepared breakfast with obsessive care. Fresh fruit, warm bread, strong coffee. She placed Lucia beside Carlos at the table, then busied herself clearing plates, staying deliberately out of the way. She watched them from the corner of her eye. Carlos tried. He really did. He asked Lucia questions, listened attentively, offered gentle humor. Lucia responded politely, but her attention drifted elsewhere, her smile forced. There was no spark. Melinda felt a strange, conflicting wave of relief and dread. Later that afternoon, she announced the next planned activity, a sunset walk along the beach. "Just the two of you," she added quickly. "I'll stay back and clean." Carlos looked at her, surprised. "You don't have to." "I want to," she insisted. Lucia agreed without hesitation. So Melinda stood on the terrace as they walked away together, side by side, their figures growing smaller against the horizon. She waited for the familiar ache of jealousy. Instead, she felt something worse. Hope. Hope that maybe she was wrong. That maybe love would finally land where she had been trying to place it all week. But when they returned an hour later, Lucia went straight to her room. Carlos lingered. "She's not ready," he said quietly. Melinda nodded. "She will be." Carlos studied her for a moment. "Why are you doing all this, Mel?" She forced a smile. "Because she deserves happiness." "And what about you?" The question hit harder than she expected. "I'm fine," she replied too quickly. Carlos didn't look convinced. That night, Melinda prepared the romantic picnic she had imagined for months. Candles in glass jars, a blanket spread beneath the stars, soft music playing from a hidden speaker. She had poured herself into it, hoping effort could replace honesty. Lucia arrived late again. She smiled politely, complimented the setup, then spent most of the evening texting. Finally, she looked up and sighed. "Mel, I know what you're doing." Melinda froze. "You're trying to set me up with Carlos?" Lucia continued gently. "And I love you for caring. But you can't force chemistry." Carlos turned to Melinda, realization dawning. Embarrassment burned through her. I just thought. I know, Lucia said, squeezing her hand. But I don't feel that way. And I don't want to pretend. She stood, brushing sand from her legs. I'm going to call Damian. And just like that she was gone. Leaving Melinda and Carlos alone under the stars, surrounded by candles meant for someone else's romance. I'm sorry, Melinda whispered. Carlos shook his head. You don't have to be. Rain began to fall suddenly, heavy, unexpected, erasing the carefully constructed moment. They rushed to save what they could, laughing despite themselves as the universe dismantled Melinda's plan piece by piece. Under the covered terrace, soaked and breathless, Carlos looked at her with something unguarded in his eyes. Some things aren't meant to be planned, he said softly. Melinda felt her heart tighten. She was beginning to understand that the hardest truth wasn't that her plan was failing. It was that her heart had been involved long before she ever admitted it. The week she spent hiding her feelings finally forced them into the light. Melinda barely slept that night. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside her refused to settle. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past 2 days. The surf lesson, the way Carlos had shielded her without hesitation, the quiet disappointment in his eyes when Lucia chose her phone over him. And worse than all of it was the question he'd asked her. What about you? She didn't have an answer. Or rather, she did, but it terrified her. When morning finally came, Melinda moved through the house like a ghost. She made coffee she didn't drink. She stared out at the ocean without seeing it. Every plan she had written so confidently now felt foolish, even cruel. She had been so focused on arranging happiness for someone else that she'd ignored the quiet truth sitting beside her for years. Carlos. Lucia left early that morning to walk into town. I need space, she'd said gently. To think. Melinda nodded, knowing exactly what Lucia meant, though the space she needed was far more complicated. Carlos was on the terrace when Melinda finally joined him. He was seated with his laptop closed, staring out at the water as if he had been waiting. They didn't speak at first. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable, just honest. Mel, Carlos said finally. We need to talk. Her heart thudded painfully. I know. He turned toward her, his expression serious but gentle. I've known what you were trying to do since the first day. She blinked. You have. I knew you were trying to bring Lucia and me together, he said. I just didn't know how to tell you without hurting you. The words struck deeper than she expected. Hurt me, she repeated softly. Carlos exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Because you never stop to ask what you want. You just fix things for everyone else. Melinda felt her throat tighten. I thought you wanted this, she admitted. You're kind stable. I thought Lucia needed someone like you. And what if I didn't want her? Carlos asked quietly. She looked up sharply. What if, he continued, voice steady but vulnerable, the person I wanted has been standing right in front of me this entire time? The world seemed to tilt. Melinda's first instinct was denial, automatic, defensive. Carlos, don't. This is just proximity. Emotion. We're all tired. I've been in love with you for years, he said. No hesitation. No dramatic pause. Just truth. Her breath caught painfully in her chest. You don't get to say that now, she whispered. Not after I've spent this entire week trying to give me away, he finished softly. Because you convinced yourself you weren't allowed to want me. Tears blurred her vision. I was scared, she admitted. I was scared that if I admitted it, I'd ruin everything. That I'd lose you. Carlos stepped closer. You already almost did. Not by wanting me, but by pretending you didn't. The words broke something open inside her. Years of restraint, of unspoken moments, of late-night conversations and silent longing all rushed forward at once. I love you, she said, barely audible. I think I always have. Carlos didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply reached out and held her hands, grounding her. Then stop hiding, he said gently. From me. From yourself. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Lucia returned, followed by someone Melinda had hoped never to see again. Damian. He walked in like he owned the place, confident and smug, his presence instantly changing the air. I drove all night, he announced. I came to get my girl back. Carlos stiffened. She's not your girl, he said flatly. Damian laughed. And who are you? The substitute. Melinda stepped forward, anger burning through her fear. You don't get to talk to her like that. Damian's eyes flicked to her, narrowing. Now it makes sense. You're jealous. Before Melinda could respond, Carlos moved. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply stood between Melinda and Damian, his voice calm and unyielding. You will leave, he said. Now. Damian scoffed, until he saw Carlos's expression. Lucia, watching the exchange, finally spoke. Go, she said quietly to Damian. I deserve better. The door closed behind him with finality. Lucia turned to Melinda, tears in her eyes, but this time they weren't from weakness. You were right, she said. About everything. And I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. Melinda hugged her tightly. For the first time, no one was pretending. That evening, as the sun sank into the ocean, Melinda and Carlos stood side by side, the week's illusion finally stripped away. No plans. No manipulation. Just truth. And for the first time, Melinda wasn't arranging love for someone else. She was finally brave enough to claim it for herself. The moment she stopped sacrificing herself for everyone else. The house felt different after Damian left. Quieter. Lighter. As if something toxic had finally been pushed out to sea with the tide. Lucia disappeared into her room for a while, needing space to process what she'd just done, what she'd finally chosen not to do. Melinda watched her go with a mix of pride and guilt, then turned to Carlos, unsure what came next. For the first time all week there was no plan. No schedule. No manipulation. No emotional choreography. Just the truth sitting between them. Carlos broke the silence first. Do you want to take a walk? Melinda nodded. They walked along the beach as the late afternoon sun softened into gold, the waves rolling in with patient rhythm. The sand was warm beneath their feet, grounding in a way Melinda hadn't realized she needed. I'm sorry, she said suddenly. Carlos stopped and turned to her. For what? For assuming what you wanted. For deciding your happiness for you. For treating love like a puzzle I could solve instead of something people choose. Carlos considered her for a moment. You did it because you're kind. But kindness without honesty turns into self-erasure. The words landed hard, but they felt true. I've spent so long being the strong one, Melinda admitted. The fixer. The girl who never needs anything. I didn't even know how to ask myself what I wanted anymore. Carlos reached for her hand, not pulling, not claiming, just offering. What do you want now? He asked. Melinda took a deep breath. I want to stop being invisible in my own life. She squeezed his hand. And I want you. Not because it's safe. Not because it makes sense. Because it's real. Carlos's eyes softened. Then let's do this right. No hiding. No pretending. They stood there, fingers intertwined as the sun dipped lower, two people choosing clarity over comfort. That evening Lucia joined them for dinner. She looked different, calmer, steadier. The fragile uncertainty she'd arrived with had been replaced by something quieter but stronger. I booked an earlier train, she announced casually. I'm going home tomorrow. Melinda's heart jumped. You don't have to. I know, Lucia said gently. This isn't about you two. It's about me. She met Melinda's eyes. I need to go back and finish what I started. I need to block him. Fully. No, just checking. No excuses. Melinda smiled, pride swelling in her chest. And you, Lucia added, glancing between them, need time. Real time. Without guilt. Carlos nodded. We'll visit. Soon. Lucia laughed softly. Take your time. You've waited long enough. Later that night, after Lucia went to bed, Melinda and Carlos sat on the terrace wrapped in a blanket, listening to the ocean. You defended her today, Melinda said quietly. Without raising your voice. Without needing to prove anything. Carlos shrugged. Respect doesn't need theatrics. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I wish I'd learned that earlier. You learned it exactly when you needed to, he replied. Melinda closed her eyes, letting the weight she'd carried for years finally loosen. The next morning Lucia left with hugs and tears, but also with certainty. When the car disappeared down the road, Melinda stood silently for a moment. Then she turned to Carlos. So, she said, nervous but smiling. Now what? Carlos grinned. Now we stop arranging romance for everyone else. He took her hands. And we see what happens when we let life meet us halfway. Melinda felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She finally chose herself, and love met her there. The final days by the sea passed differently than the first. There were no schedules taped to the fridge. No carefully engineered moments. No quiet manipulation disguised as kindness. There was simply time. Time to wake up slowly. Time to drink coffee barefoot on the terrace. Time to talk, really talk, about everything they had never said. Melinda learned that Carlos had almost said something years ago, the night she showed up at his door after a bad breakup, mascara streaked and heartbroken. He learned how many times she had chosen silence because she thought wanting him would be selfish. They laughed about it now, but there was a quiet grief too, an understanding of how many moments they had both survived separately while standing inches apart. You know, Melinda said one afternoon as they sat on the sand watching the tide come in, I used to think love was something you earned by being useful. Carlos looked at her. You don't need to earn being chosen. She nodded slowly. I know that now. When they returned to Madrid, reality didn't collapse around them like Melinda had feared. Friends noticed the change first, not in how often they held hands but in how Melinda spoke. Straighter. Clear. No longer apologizing for existing. At work, when a colleague dismissed her idea in a meeting, she calmly repeated it, this time louder. When the same idea was praised 5 minutes later by someone else, she didn't let it slide. That was my proposal, she said evenly. The room went quiet. Respect followed. Carlos watched these moments with quiet pride, never stepping in, never overshadowing, just standing beside her. Lucia called often. Not to cry. Not to spiral. To talk about therapy. About blocking Damian. About learning how to sit with loneliness without running back to harm. You were right, Lucia said one night. But more importantly, you showed me what choosing yourself looks like. Melinda smiled. You did that on your own. No, Lucia replied. I just finally stopped ignoring the example. Months later, on a quiet evening, Melinda and Carlos returned to the coast. The same beach. The same horizon. But this time, Melinda hadn't arranged anything. No candles. No playlist. No expectations. Carlos turned to her as the sun dipped low. You know what I love most about us? She raised an eyebrow. Only one thing? He smiled. That you don't disappear anymore. Melinda felt emotion rise in her chest, but it wasn't fear this time. It was certainty. She took his hand. Neither do you. They stood there as equals, not saviors, not fixers, not background characters in someone else's story. Just two people who had finally learned that love doesn't